Prague Castle, morning in 1618. Three men stand at a window 70 feet above the ground. They are Imperial regents, representatives of Emperor Ferdinand, Catholics ruling over a Protestant population that has run out of patience. The room is packed with Bohemian nobles, Protestant nobles, men who have watched their churches destroyed, their rights stripped away, their people oppressed. They came here to talk. Diplomacy, negotiation, all the civilized tools that powerful men use to avoid bloodshed. It is not going well. Count Heinrich Matthias von Thurn stands near the front of the crowd. He is 48 years old, a Bohemian aristocrat who has spent years trying to work within the system, trying to reason with an empire that does not reason, trying to find compromise with an emperor who does not compromise. The regents are dismissive, condescending. They speak for Ferdinand, and Ferdinand has made his position clear. Protestant rights are negotiable. Protestant existence is negotiable. The conversation escalates, someone shouts, then someone else. The crowd presses forward. Thurn watches it happen as if in slow motion. He knows this moment will define everything that comes after. The nobles grab the first regent. The man struggles, screaming, as he is dragged toward the window. Then the second regent. Then a secretary who made the mistake of being in the room. They throw them out. 70 feet down into the castle moat. The men fall, tumbling through empty air, arms flailing, voices lost in the wind. They hit the ground with impacts that should kill them instantly. But the moat is filled with refuse, garbage, manure, decades of accumulated filth. The men sink into it, cushioned by rot. They survive, injured, humiliated, covered in excrement, but alive. The nobles stare down at them in stunned silence. What they have just done cannot be undone. They have assaulted the emperor's representatives. They have committed treason. There is no walking this back. Thurn understands this better than anyone in the room. He has just crossed a line that emperors do not forgive. The Habsburg Empire does not forgive. Ferdinand will send his armies. He will come with everything he has. He will burn Prague to ashes and execute every man in this room. The other nobles are still staring out the window, some laughing nervously, some already looking terrified. Thurn turns away. His mind is already moving forward, calculating, planning. They have started something they cannot stop. A war is coming, an empire is coming, and Bohemia, this small Protestant kingdom in the heart of Catholic Europe, is about to face annihilation. Thurn walks toward the door. The laughter behind him sounds like drowning men trying to convince themselves they can still breathe. Someone has to prepare for what comes next. Someone has to turn this act of defiance into something that can survive the storm. He knows it will probably be him. The diplomatic solution just went out the window, literally. Now comes the blood. To understand what happened at that window, you need to understand what Bohemia had become by 1618. This was not some spontaneous act of rage. This was the explosion of pressure that had been building for decades. Bohemia was different. While most of Europe was splitting along religious lines, Bohemians had found something rare: tolerance. Catholics and Protestants living in the same kingdom, worshiping differently but coexisting. It was not perfect, but it worked. The Letter of Majesty, signed in 1609 by Emperor Rudolf, guaranteed religious freedom. Protestants could build churches, practice their faith, hold positions of power. It was written law, imperial law. It was supposed to be permanent. Then Ferdinand came to power. Ferdinand II was a man who saw the world in absolutes, Catholic or heretic, loyal or traitor. There was no middle ground, no compromise, no tolerance. He believed God had placed him on the throne to purify his empire, and purification meant eliminating Protestantism entirely. He started slowly, restricting where Protestants could worship, limiting their right to build new churches, installing Catholic officials in Protestant towns, small cuts, testing how much resistance he would face. The Protestants protested. They pointed to the Letter of Majesty. They demanded their legal rights be respected. Ferdinand ignored them. Legal rights, he believed, were privileges granted by emperors, and emperors could revoke them. Then came the churches. In Protestant towns across Bohemia, new churches were being built, paid for by Protestant communities, constructed on land they believed they had the right to use. Ferdinand declared the construction illegal. He sent soldiers. They tore the churches down, not just demolished them, desecrated them, burned the timber, scattered the stones, turned holy ground into pastures for livestock. The message was clear. Your faith has no future here. The Protestant nobility tried negotiation. They sent delegations to Vienna. They wrote letters. They appealed to imperial law, to precedent, to reason. Ferdinand sent back demands for submission: convert or be disenfranchised, accept Catholic authority or lose your lands. The economic pressure was just as brutal. Protestant merchants faced higher taxes. Protestant landowners watched as their Catholic neighbors received favorable treatment from imperial courts. Protestant families saw their sons barred from universities, their daughters unable to marry into families with imperial connections. Bohemia was being strangled slowly. The tolerance that had defined the kingdom was being systematically destroyed, and everyone knew where this was heading. What happened to Protestants in Spain? What happened to Protestants in Italy? Conversion or exile, sometimes worse. By 1618, Bohemia was a powder keg. Every Protestant noble, every Protestant merchant, every Protestant farmer understood that their way of life was ending. The only question was whether they would accept it quietly or fight back. The answer came at a window in Prague Castle. 3 men thrown into a moat, diplomacy abandoned, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Ferdinand had pushed too hard, and Bohemia, backed into a corner with nowhere left to retreat, pushed back. Now they would all learn what that defiance would cost. Heinrich Matthias von Thurn was not a warrior. He was an administrator, a nobleman who managed estates and attended court functions. He could ride a horse and shoot a hunting rifle, but he had never commanded soldiers in battle. He had never stormed a fortress or led a cavalry charge. Now he was the closest thing the rebellion had to a general. After the defenestration, the Protestant nobles needed someone to organize their defense, someone respected, capable, and crazy enough to accept a job that was probably suicide. Thurn fit the description, or at least no one else volunteered. He stood in the council chamber in Prague, looking at maps spread across a table. The maps showed the problem clearly. The rebels controlled Prague and maybe a dozen towns in the surrounding countryside. Everything else belonged to the emperor. The entire Habsburg Empire, stretching from Spain to Austria, from Italy to the Netherlands. The arithmetic was simple. Bohemia had maybe 3 million people. The Habsburg Empire had 20 million. Bohemia had no army. The empire had the most powerful military machine in Europe. Bohemia had minimal funds. The empire had the wealth of a continent. Thurn was supposed to defend against that. His advisors talked about alliances. Protestant kingdoms in Germany might help. The Saxons, the Palatinate, maybe even the Danes. Surely they would see the threat Ferdinand posed to all Protestants. Surely they would send troops. Thurn listened and said nothing. He had spent enough time in politics to know that surely was the word desperate men used when they had no real plan. Other kingdoms had their own problems. They would send sympathy, maybe some money. Actual armies would take months to negotiate, if they came at all. He had weeks, maybe less. Ferdinand would not wait for Protestant alliances to form. He would strike fast, crush the rebellion before it could spread, make an example of Prague that would terrify every other Protestant region into submission. Thurn sent messengers racing across Bohemia. He called up the nobility's private guards, hired every mercenary he could find, and issued a general summons for volunteers. He emptied the treasury to buy weapons and gunpowder. He confiscated horses from Catholic loyalists and seized food supplies from imperial estates. It was not enough. It would never be enough. His officers were amateurs like himself, minor nobles and merchants who knew more about trade routes than battle tactics. They looked to him for leadership, for confidence, for some indication that he knew what he was doing. Thurn gave them orders and hoped they sounded competent. Late at night, alone in his chamber, he studied military manuals, ancient Roman tactics, accounts of medieval sieges, anything that might give him an advantage. He was trying to learn in days what professional commanders spent lifetimes mastering. The reality pressed down on him like a physical weight. He was going to lead Bohemia's sons into battle against the most powerful empire on earth. Most of them would die. Probably him too. And when it was over, Ferdinand would execute the survivors and wipe the rebellion from history. But what was the alternative? Surrender? Beg for mercy from an emperor who showed none? Watch his people forced into conversion or exile? Thurn closed the military manual and stared at the candle flame. He was not a warrior, but he was all Bohemia had. So he would learn, he would prepare, he would lead. And when the empire came, he would make them fight for every inch. Vienna, the Imperial Palace. Emperor Ferdinand II sat in his private chamber reading dispatches from Prague. His hands were steady, but his jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. They had thrown his regents out a window, his representatives speaking with his authority, acting as extensions of his imperial will, thrown 70 feet into a moat like common criminals. The humiliation was not just personal. It was an attack on the concept of imperial authority itself. Ferdinand was 40 years old, a man who believed his power came directly from God. To defy him was to defy divine order. To rebel against him was to rebel against heaven. There was no greater sin, no greater crime. He called for his military advisors. The Habsburg Empire was the most powerful political entity in Europe. Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, and the Netherlands, all under one crown. The empire had professional armies that had fought across 3 continents. It had resources that smaller kingdoms could not imagine. Ferdinand gave the order: crush the rebellion. Completely. No negotiation, no mercy, no compromise. Every rebel leader was to be executed. Every town that supported the rebellion would be occupied. Prague would be made an example that would echo across Europe for generations. The man chosen to command the operation was Charles Bonaventure de Longueval, Count of Bucquois. He was a professional soldier, a veteran of wars in France, Italy, and the Low Countries. He had spent 30 years learning how to break armies and conquer fortresses. Bucquois received his orders without emotion. This was not personal for him. It was a job, a military problem with a military solution. He began assembling the army. The Catholic League contributed troops. These were German princes loyal to Ferdinand, men who saw the Bohemian rebellion as a threat to Catholic power across the empire. They sent veteran infantry, experienced pikemen and musketeers who had fought Protestant forces before. Spain sent tercios. These were the elite, units of the Spanish army, formations that had dominated European battlefields for decades. Disciplined, professional, and absolutely lethal. Each tercio was 1,500 men moving as a single entity. The Spanish contributed 10 of them. Austrian forces formed the core. Imperial cavalry, German mercenaries, artillery trains with massive bronze cannons, logistics units that could supply an army on the march, engineers who could build bridges, dig siege trenches, and construct fortifications. The army grew. 20,000 men, 40,000, 60,000. Nobles from across the empire volunteered to join, seeing this as a chance to prove loyalty to Ferdinand and earn rewards when the rebellion was crushed. Mercenaries flocked to the banners, attracted by promises of plunder and regular pay. By the time Bucquois finished assembling his force, he commanded 100,000 men. The largest army seen in Central Europe in living memory. An army that could conquer kingdoms. Bucquois studied maps of Bohemia. Prague was the target, but the rebels would not simply wait to be besieged. They would try to defend the approaches, slow the imperial advance, buy time for their imaginary allies to arrive. It did not matter. Bucquois had faced desperate defenders before. He knew how sieges ended. He knew how rebellions ended, with corpses and ashes and widows weeping over mass graves. He gave the order to march. 100,000 men turned north toward Bohemia. The empire was coming, and nothing on earth was going to stop it. The rebellion had days left to live. They just did not know it yet. The recruitment centers in Prague were chaos. Every day hundreds of men arrived, volunteers responding to Thurn's call to defend Bohemia. They came from farms and villages, from merchant shops and university halls. They came because they believed in the cause, because they feared what Ferdinand would do if the rebellion failed, because they had nowhere else to go. Thurn walked through the crowd and felt despair settle in his chest. These were not soldiers. A blacksmith from Moravia who had never touched a musket, a university student whose hands were softer than a noble lady's, farmers who knew how to swing a scythe but not a pike, old men who remembered battles from decades ago, boys who lied about their age because they thought war was glorious. This was what he had to stop in Empire. The professional mercenaries he hired looked at the volunteers with barely concealed contempt. These hard men who sold their skills to the highest bidder knew what real soldiers looked like. This was not it. But there was no time to be selective. There was no time to wait for better recruits. The Imperial army was already marching. So Thurn gave the order: train them. The mercenary sergeants began the brutal work of turning farmers into something resembling infantry. They taught the recruits how to hold a musket without shooting themselves, how to load, prime, and fire in sequence, how to stand in formation without breaking when cannons roared. The training was measured in days. Professional soldiers trained for months. These men got 2 weeks. They learned pike drill, the fundamental tactic of 16th century warfare, long wooden poles with steel points wielded by men standing shoulder to shoulder. The pike square was supposed to be an impenetrable formation, bristling with points that cavalry could not charge, that infantry could not break. But pike fighting required trust. You had to believe the man next to you would hold his position. You had to move as a unit, advance and retreat together, hold formation even when the world was exploding around you. That trust took time to build. They did not have time. Thurn watched a drill where half the formation collapsed because one man stepped wrong. He watched recruits drop their muskets when sergeants fired blank charges to simulate battle noise. He watched men who would be dead in weeks learning skills they would never master. The weapons were as problematic as the men. Thurn had bought every musket and pike he could find, but Bohemia was not a military power. The weapons were outdated, mismatched, poorly maintained. Some of the muskets were older than the men carrying them. Ammunition was limited. Gunpowder was expensive, and Bohemia had no manufactories. Every shot fired in training was one less shot available for battle, but men who had never fired a weapon needed to practice. The balance was impossible. At night, Thurn walked past the training fields and listened to the sounds: men coughing from the smoke, sergeants cursing, the clatter of pike shafts colliding as formations tried to wheel. Somewhere, someone was praying. His officers asked him questions he could not answer. How long until the Imperial army arrives? What is our strategy? Where will we make our stand? Thurn gave orders that sounded confident and felt like lies. The truth was simple and terrible. He was sending unprepared men to fight professional killers. He was arming farmers with weapons they barely knew how to use and pointing them at an empire. He was creating an army that any competent commander would destroy in an afternoon. But it was all he had. So he trained them. He armed them. He prepared them as best he could in the time that remained, and he prayed that when the moment came, desperation would be enough. Thurn stood on a hilltop north of Prague, staring at the landscape. Maps were spread on a table before him, weighed down with stones against the wind. His officers clustered around, waiting for him to speak. He was looking for a miracle. A place where terrain could substitute for training, where geography could multiply his meager forces, where 2,000 men might hold against 100,000. Then he saw it. The pass at Záblatí, a narrow valley cut through hills about 20 miles north of Prague. The approach was constricted, barely wide enough for a column of troops to march through in formation. On either side, steep slopes rose sharply, too steep for cavalry, difficult even for infantry. The high ground dominated everything. Anyone holding those slopes could fire down on troops advancing through the valley. It was a natural choke point, the kind of terrain that turned battles. Thurn traced the contours with his finger. If he could fortify those heights, if he could hold that pass, he might be able to stop the Imperial army. Not defeat them, he was not delusional, but delay them, bleed them. Buy time for Protestant allies to arrive. It was the only chance he had. He gave the order: move the army to the pass, begin fortifications immediately. Over the next days, 2,000 men transformed the landscape. They dug earthwork ramparts across the high ground, piling dirt and stone into barriers that would absorb cannon fire. They cut logs and drove them into the earth as palisades. They cleared fields of fire, removing brush and trees so nothing could hide advancing troops. Engineers, the few professionals Thurn had managed to hire, directed the construction. Earthworks had to be angled correctly to deflect cannonballs. Firing positions had to allow muskets to cover the approach without exposing the defenders. Trenches had to be deep enough for men to move safely behind the lines. The civilians, women and old men, and children who had followed the army worked alongside the soldiers. They carried stones, hauled timber, cooked food for men too exhausted to rest. This was not just a military operation, it was an entire community preparing for survival. Thurn's few cannons, outdated pieces that would be outmatched by Imperial artillery, were positioned on the highest points. They would not win an artillery duel, but they could fire down into the valley, and gravity would add range to their shots. Obstacles were constructed across the valley floor, sharpened stakes driven into the ground at angles, barriers of logs chained together, anything that would slow an infantry advance and channel troops into killing zones. The pass was becoming a fortress, not a castle with stone walls, but a fortress nonetheless, a place where small numbers could fight larger forces, where desperation had a chance against professionalism. Thurn walked the fortifications every evening, checking, adjusting, improving. His officers reported on progress, earthworks completed on the eastern slope, ammunition distributed to firing positions, water sources secured for the defenders, but numbers did not lie. 2,700 men, many of them barely trained, against 100,000 professional soldiers with artillery support and cavalry reserves. The pass was good ground. The fortifications were solid. The plan was sound. It was also probably suicide. Thurn stood at the highest point, looking north toward the direction the Imperial army would come. Somewhere out there, Bouquet was marching. 100,000 men who did not know. They were walking into a trap. Or maybe not a trap. Maybe just a delay. Maybe just a gesture. Maybe just a place where Bohemian rebels would make the empire pay for every inch of ground. The pass was ready. Now they waited. The Imperial army marched north like a force of nature. 100,000 men moving in coordinated columns stretched across miles of road. From a distance, it looked like the landscape itself was moving. The soldiers knew this would be easy. They were professionals facing amateurs, veterans confronting farmers with pitchforks. This was not war. This was suppression. They would crush the rebellion, occupy Prague, and be home before winter. The cavalry scouts rode ahead, ranging across the countryside. They reported back to Bouquet. The rebels had abandoned defensive positions around Prague. They were retreating north, maybe planning to flee into Saxony, maybe hoping to link up with Protestant allies. Bouquet adjusted his march. He would intercept them, pin them against the mountains, and destroy them in open battle. The campaign would be over in an afternoon. In the rebel camp at the pass, scouts brought news. The Imperial army was moving. 3 days away, maybe less. The numbers were confirmed, more than 100,000. The reports seemed impossible, but every scout confirmed them. The empire was coming with everything it had. Thurn called his officers together. The mood was grim. Everyone understood the mathematics. They were outnumbered 40-1. No amount of training, no fortification, no amount of courage would overcome those odds in a sustained battle. But they did not need to win. They just needed to hold. Long enough for the emperor to reconsider. Long enough for Protestant allies to mobilize. Long enough for something, anything, to change the impossible equation. The soldiers began preparing in the way soldiers always prepare when death is approaching. They wrote letters to families, knowing the letters would probably never be delivered. They checked their weapons obsessively, cleaning muskets that were already clean, sharpening pikes that were already sharp. The priest moved through the camp offering communion, Protestant clergy who had fled Catholic persecution, now ministering to men who would die defending Protestant rights. The prayers had a desperate quality. Not asking God for victory, just asking to be remembered, to have their deaths mean something. The Imperial army was 2 days away. Then 1 day. The scouts reported the vanguard was visible on the southern horizon, cavalry, thousands of horsemen. Behind them, the infantry columns, behind them, the artillery train. bronze cannons pulled by teams of oxen, each gun requiring 50 men to maneuver. From the high ground at the pass, the defenders watched the horizon darken. It looked like storm clouds, but it was an army. The dust raised by 100,000 men marching. The earth trembled with the rhythm of their footsteps. Night fell. The Imperial camp appeared in the valley below, thousands of fires spreading across the landscape. The glow was visible for miles. An army so large it looked like a city had suddenly appeared. The rebels stood on their earthworks and stared. Some men wept, some prayed, some just stood in silence, too overwhelmed to react. One of the younger soldiers, a farm boy from Moravia, asked his sergeant a question. "How do we fight that?" The sergeant, a mercenary who had seen battles across Europe, looked at the fires below and gave the only honest answer he could. "We die well. The army was here. Tomorrow, the killing would begin." And everyone on that mountain understood that most of them would not see another sunset. The Empire had arrived. Now they would all learn what it meant to defy it. The night before battle is different from other nights. Time moves strangely. Minutes feel like hours. Hours evaporate like smoke. Men experience their entire lives compressed into a handful of moments. On the mountain at Záblatí, 2,700 men prepared to die. They moved through the darkness, checking equipment for the 100th time. Muskets that had been loaded and reloaded until the motions became automatic. Pikes that had been inspected, set down, picked up, inspected again. Hands needed something to do. Idle hands meant time to think, and thinking led to places no one wanted to go. A farmer named Jan from a village near Brno sat behind an earthwork writing a letter by candlelight. His hands shook, making the words barely legible. He was writing to his wife and daughters, explaining why he had volunteered, explaining that some things were worth fighting for even when you knew you would lose. He folded the letter and tucked it inside his shirt. If he died, someone might find it, might carry it home, might let his family know that he had been thinking of them at the end. A university student, barely 20, knelt in prayer with a Protestant chaplain. He had come to Prague to study philosophy. Now he was on a mountain waiting for an empire to kill him. He asked the chaplain if God would forgive him for being afraid. The chaplain, an old man who had buried more young men than he could count, put a hand on the student's shoulder. "Fear is not sin," he said. "Fear is wisdom. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is acting despite it." The mercenary sergeants, professional soldiers who had fought in a dozen wars, sat together sharing wine. They knew what tomorrow would bring. They had seen enough battles to recognize a doomed position, but they had been paid, and they had given their word, and a mercenary's reputation was everything. One of them, a Bavarian named Klaus who had lost 3 fingers in Italy, looked at the valley below. He counted the Imperial fires and did calculations in his head. The numbers were absurd. He drank more wine and decided not to share his conclusions. Thurn walked the lines alone. His officers had urged him to rest, to conserve his strength for tomorrow. He ignored them. These men were here because of him, because of orders he gave. The least he could do was bear witness to their final night. He stopped at every position, spoke quietly with soldiers, asked about their homes, their families, listened to their fears without offering false comfort. When a young man asked if they would win tomorrow, Thurn did not lie. "I do not know," he said, "but I know we will make them remember us." In the valley below, the Imperial camp was a city of light. Soldiers around fires, confident and relaxed. Officers in tents planning the next day's assault, Bucoi reviewing maps, deciding which units would lead the attack. The Imperials were not afraid. Why would they be? They outnumbered the rebels 40-1. They had cannons, cavalry, professional infantry. This would not be a battle. This would be an execution. On the mountain, the defenders waited for dawn. Some men slept fitfully, dreaming of home. Some stared at the sky, memorizing stars. Some held hands with the man next to them, needing human contact in the darkness. A farmer turned soldier whispered to his friend, "Tomorrow we will be heroes or corpses," his friend replied. "Probably both." The night passed. Slowly, inevitably, the eastern sky began to lighten. Dawn was coming, and with it, hell. Dawn broke over the pass with deceptive beauty. Clear skies, cool air, the kind of morning that promised a perfect day. Then the Imperial cannons spoke, and beauty died. The bombardment began without warning, 50 bronze guns firing simultaneously, the sound rolling across the valley like thunder that would not stop. The heavy balls screamed through the air, massive projectiles that could punch through castle walls. They hit the earthworks with devastating force. Dirt exploded upward, wooden palisades shattered. Men who had been standing watch were flung backward, killed by concussion before the iron even touched them. The defenders pressed themselves flat behind the ramparts. The noise was overwhelming, a physical force that made thought impossible. This was not combat. This was being crushed by sound itself. Thurn's cannons returned fire, the few pieces he had roared defiance, sending balls down into the valley. Gravity gave them range, and a few shots struck Imperial positions. Men died, cannons were damaged, but it was symbolic resistance, not military threat. The Imperial artillery adjusted. Gunners who had practiced their craft for years, who could calculate angles and charges by instinct. The bombardment became more precise. Earthworks that had taken days to build were systematically demolished. Firing positions were destroyed. Gaps appeared in the defenses. The rebel soldiers huddled behind shrinking protection and prayed. Men were killed without ever seeing the enemy. A cannonball would strike, and 3 men would simply cease to exist. No chance to fight, no chance to run. Just gone. After an hour, the Imperial cannons stopped. In the sudden silence, men's ears rang. Some were deaf, temporarily or permanently. Others were in shock, unable to process what they had just endured. Then they heard the drums. Imperial infantry began forming in the valley below. Professional soldiers assembling into assault columns with mechanical precision. Flags were raised. Officers shouted orders. The formations began to move forward. This was the moment every defender had been dreading. The actual fighting. The part where they had to stand up, expose themselves, and face soldiers who killed for a living. Thurn moved along the line, his voice carried over the ramparts. "Hold your fire. Wait for my signal. Let them come close." The Imperial advance was methodical. No rush, no wild charge. Just steady, inexorable forward movement. Thousands of men climbing the slope, pike formations in front, musketeers behind, moving as single organisms. They came within 200 yards. Then 100. The defenders could see their faces now. Professional soldiers, confident and experienced. Men who had stormed fortifications before, who knew how this would end. 75 yards, 50 yards. Thurn raised his sword. Every musketeer along the line sighted down their barrel, picking targets. Time stretched. The Imperial soldiers kept climbing. 40 yards, 30 yards. Thurn dropped his sword. The world exploded. 700 muskets fired simultaneously. The valley filled with smoke and thunder. The front rank of Imperial soldiers simply collapsed. Dozens dead instantly. Dozens more wounded, screaming, clutching shattered limbs. But the men behind them kept coming. The musketeers reloaded frantically. Measure powder, pour it down the barrel, ram the ball home, prime the pan. Experienced men could do it in 30 seconds. These farmers and students took 45 seconds, 50 seconds, an eternity when professional soldiers were closing the distance. The Imperials hit the earthworks at a run, and the real killing began. Hand-to-hand combat at close quarters is not heroic. It is not glorious. It is desperate brutality, men killing and dying in seconds, the outcome determined by luck as much as skill. The Imperial soldiers swarmed over the earthworks. Professional infantry, trained to fight in tight formations, to use pikes and swords in coordination. They expected the defenders to break, to run, to collapse like militia always collapsed when faced with real soldiers. The defenders did not break. Maybe it was because they had nowhere to run. Maybe it was because they knew breaking meant execution. Maybe it was because Thurn had spent 2 weeks drilling into them that their only chance was to stand together. They fought. A farmer named John, the one who had written letters to his daughters, found himself facing an Imperial pikeman. The soldier thrust at his chest. John deflected with his own pike, the wooden shafts clashing. They circled, thrust again, neither gaining advantage. Then the Imperial soldier feinted high and drove his point into John's stomach. The farmer collapsed, blood soaking into the dirt. The Imperial soldier turned to find his next target and was shot in the face by a student with a musket. The fighting became a formless melee. No formations, no tactics, just men killing at arm's reach. Pikes were too long for close combat, so soldiers drew swords, daggers, anything with an edge. Some fought with bare hands, grappling and clawing. The earthworks channeled the fighting into narrow spaces where numbers meant less. An Imperial soldier tried to climb over a rampart and was grabbed by 3 defenders. They dragged him over and stabbed him repeatedly until he stopped moving. Then they turned to face the next soldier climbing up behind him. A mercenary sergeant, the Bavarian Klaus, with 3 missing fingers, held a breach in the palisade. 5 Imperial soldiers tried to force through. Klaus met them with a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other. He killed 2 before a pike took him through the shoulder. He kept fighting one-handed until blood loss made him collapse. The defenders were outmatched in skill. Imperial soldiers knew how to kill efficiently, how to exploit weaknesses, how to coordinate attacks. But the defenders had desperation. They knew this position was all that stood between their families and Imperial occupation. They knew surrender meant execution. So they fought like men with nothing to lose. After an hour of savage combat, the Imperial assault began to lose momentum. The attackers had taken horrific casualties. Bodies clogged the approaches. The narrow space meant their numerical advantage was neutralized. They could not bring overwhelming force to bear when only a handful of men could fight in each breach. Officers in the Imperial ranks saw the problem. They called for withdrawal to regroup. Horns sounded. The Imperial soldiers pulled back, dragging wounded comrades, leaving their dead. On the mountain, the defenders stood among the carnage and gasped for breath. They had survived, barely. The earthworks were breached in a dozen places. Bodies, Imperial and rebel both, lay everywhere. The smell of blood and voided bowels hung in the air. Casualty reports came to Thurn. 80 dead, over 100 wounded, many too severely to fight again. He had started with 2,700, now he had 2,500 effective fighters, and the Imperial army had barely committed a fraction of its force. This was just the opening probe. The real assault was still coming. Thurn walked the lines, helping to rebuild barricades, speaking encouragement to exhausted men. They had won the first round. They had stopped professional soldiers. They had proved resistance was possible. Now they had to do it again, and again, until the Empire ran out of patience or they ran out of men. The Imperial assaults came like waves against rocks, each one different, each one testing a new approach, each one costing lives on both sides. Bucquoy watched from his command position in the valley, studying the defenses through a telescope. This was not going as planned. The rebels should have collapsed by now. Professional infantry should have swept these farmers aside like chaff. Instead, they were holding. Barely, desperately, but holding. He ordered the second assault, more men, different tactics. This time the infantry would be supported by musketeers, providing covering fire. The attackers would advance under a screen of lead, keeping the defenders pinned while assault troops closed the distance. It was a sound plan. It should have worked. The Imperial musketeers lined up in the valley and began firing in organized volleys. Hundreds of musket balls hammered the earthworks. Defenders who exposed themselves to return fire were cut down instantly. The covering fire was devastating and professional. Under that covering screen, assault troops advanced. They carried ladders now, proper siege equipment for scaling the earthworks. They carried axes to hack through wooden palisades. They came prepared. They reached the defenses and threw up the ladders. Soldiers began climbing. The defenders met them at the top with pikes, swords, and desperation. Men fell screaming. Ladders were pushed backward, carrying soldiers down with them. But the Imperial soldiers kept coming. They were relentless, disciplined, accepting casualties as the cost of victory. For every man who fell, another took his place. The assault was grinding, mechanical, inevitable. A section of the eastern earthwork collapsed under the pressure. Imperial soldiers poured through the gap. For a critical moment, the defense was breached. If the Imperials could exploit the opening, could flood troops through, the entire position would collapse. Thurn saw the crisis. He grabbed every available man near him, maybe 30 soldiers, and personally led a counterattack into the breach. He did not think. He just moved, because that was what commanders did when everything was falling apart. They hit the Imperial soldiers in the breach with pure fury. Thurn fought with a sword, slashing at anything in an enemy uniform. Men died on both sides, hacked down in seconds of brutal close combat. The Imperials were pushed back. The breach was retaken. Defenders rushed to build a barricade across the gap, piling corpses and rubble to plug the hole. Thurn stumbled backward, breathing hard. His arm burned. He looked down and saw blood. A sword had cut through his sleeve, opened a gash from elbow to wrist. He had not even felt it in the chaos. An officer tried to pull him back to have the wound dressed. Thurn refused. If he left the line now, even for medical treatment, morale would shatter. He wrapped a cloth around his arm and stayed. The assault continued for hours, wave after wave, each one a variation on the same theme. Imperial soldiers attacking, defenders barely holding, casualties mounting on both sides. 16-year-old boy, a merchant's son from Prague, died holding a position after all the adults around him had fallen. He fought alone for minutes against 3 Imperial soldiers before being cut down. A woman, one of the civilians who had followed the army, grabbed a musket from a dead soldier and fired point blank into an Imperial officer's chest. Then, she picked up another musket and fired again. She killed 4 men before an arrow took her through the throat. By afternoon, the defenses were barely recognizable. The earthworks were collapsed in multiple places. Bodies lay in piles. The living fought from behind walls of the dead. Blood mixed with mud, making the ground slippery and treacherous. But the line held. Somehow, impossibly, the line held. As sunset approached, the Imperial assault finally stopped. Horns sounded withdrawal. The soldiers pulled back, exhausted and bloodied. On the mountain, what remained of the defenders collapsed where they stood. They had survived another day. Barely. Thurn understood that courage alone would not hold the pass. He needed to get inside Bucquoy's head. He needed to make the Imperial commander doubt, hesitate, question the intelligence reports telling him this should be easy. So he began a campaign of deception. Between assaults, when the fighting paused and both sides caught their breath, Thurn had his men perform elaborate theater. Small groups of soldiers would march behind the ridgeline, visible to Imperial observers, but at a distance. They would march from left to right, then circle back hidden and march again. The same 200 men passing the same viewpoint 5 times, creating the illusion of 1,000. At night, fires were lit across the mountainside in patterns suggesting a much larger camp. Supply wagons, actually the same 3 wagons, were driven back and forth along visible routes. Observers in the valley would see a constant stream of supplies arriving, when in reality, the defenders were running dangerously low on everything. The psychological warfare extended to sound. Protestant hymns were sung loudly, entire formations raising their voices in defiant prayer. The singing carried across the valley, projecting confidence and faith. Cannons were fired at irregular intervals throughout the night, not at targets, but simply to make noise, to suggest the defenders had ammunition to waste. Imperial scouts captured during failed assaults were treated well, given food and water, then released. But during their captivity, they were accidentally allowed to see things, stacks of barrels that might be gunpowder but were actually filled with dirt, formations of soldiers that included wooden posts dressed in uniforms to inflate numbers, conversations deliberately held within earshot about reinforcements arriving from Saxony. It was all lies, careful, systematic, theatrical lies designed to make Bucquoy think twice, and it worked, partially. In the Imperial camp, Bucquoy reviewed reports from his scouts and intelligence officers. The numbers did not make sense. His forces had killed or wounded hundreds of rebels, yet the defense showed no signs of weakening. Either the garrison was larger than estimated, or they had received reinforcements. The second possibility worried him more. If Protestant forces from Saxony had slipped through, if this was not an isolated pocket of resistance, but the beginning of a coordinated Protestant uprising, then he was potentially exposed. His supply lines stretched back to Vienna. A force moving from the north could cut him off, trap him between 2 armies. His officers argued over the intelligence. Some insisted the rebels were finished, that one more major assault would break them. Others urged caution, suggested pulling back to better defensive ground and waiting for clearer intelligence. Bucquoy was caught between military logic and political pressure. Logic said the rebels could not hold much longer. Politics said Ferdinand expected quick victory, crushing defeat of the rebellion, an example made. Weather became a factor. Summer storms rolled through the region, turning roads to mud. Supply wagons bogged down. Artillery pieces required double teams of oxen to move. The campaign that should have been finished in days was stretching into a week, then longer. Morale in the imperial camp began to suffer. Professional soldiers started questioning why they were dying to take a minor mountain pass. Casualties were mounting, over 3,000 dead or wounded, against farmers. The humiliation was worse than the losses. Thurn did not know any of this. He just kept performing his deceptions, kept making noise and marching men in circles, kept projecting strength he did not have. He was fighting two battles. One was physical, bullets and blades on the earthworks. The other was psychological, smoke and mirrors in Bucquoy's mind. Both were desperate, both were critical, and both were costing everything he had left. The moment came midday when the defenses should have held but did not. A concentrated imperial assault on the eastern barricade, led by veteran Spanish tercio infantry who knew exactly how to break fortified positions. They came in organized waves, accepting casualties, pushing forward over their own dead. The defenders met them with everything left, but everything left was not enough. The barricade cracked, then broke. Imperial soldiers poured through, 30 men, 50, 100. They spread out behind the main earthworks, attacking defensive positions from behind. The defense was collapsing in real time. Thurn saw it happening, saw the moment when organization dissolved into chaos, saw soldiers beginning to run, the infectious panic that destroys armies. He did not think. He grabbed his sword and screamed for anyone near him to follow. Maybe 50 men responded, maybe 40. It did not matter. They charged directly into the breach. This was not tactics. This was desperation incarnate. A middle-aged administrator who had learned warfare from books, leading farmers and merchants in a suicidal counterattack because there was literally nothing else to do. They hit the imperial soldiers in a shock collision. Thurn swung his sword like a madman. No technique, just fury and fear. Men crashed together, stabbing, clubbing, biting. Combat at a range measured in inches. An imperial soldier thrust a pike at Thurn's chest. The point caught his armor, glanced off, tore a gash across his ribs. Thurn felt the impact, felt blood hot against his skin. He swung his sword in a backhand arc and caught the soldier across the face. The man went down. Another soldier grabbed Thurn from behind, dragging him backward. Thurn drove his elbow into the man's face, feeling cartilage crunch. He spun and stabbed. The sword went into the soldier's gut. The man's eyes went wide. Thurn pulled the blade free and the soldier collapsed. Around him, his counterattack was dying. Men were falling, overwhelmed by superior numbers and skill. But they were buying seconds, precious seconds for other defenders to rally, to form a line, to plug the breach. A university student, the one who had prayed with the chaplain, threw himself at an imperial officer with nothing but a dagger. He stabbed the officer twice before being cut down by 3 soldiers. His body fell across the gap, one more obstacle. The farmer John, who had written letters to his daughters, was already dead, but his friend fought with John's pike, defending the position they had shared. He killed 2 imperial soldiers before a musket ball took him through the chest. The breach was a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled so high they formed their own fortification. The living climbed over the dead to continue fighting. Blood made the ground impossible to stand on without slipping. Thurn felt his strength failing. Blood loss, exhaustion, the accumulated trauma of days of combat. His vision tunneled. He could hear his heartbeat, loud and irregular. He knew he was dying. Then defenders arrived. Fresh troops, men who had been held in reserve for exactly this crisis. They crashed into the Imperial soldiers from the side, and the momentum shifted. The Imperials, suddenly attacked from an unexpected angle, began to pull back. They retreated through the breach, fighting every step, dragging wounded comrades. Thurn collapsed against an earthwork. Someone pressed cloth against his wounds. An officer was shouting orders to rebuild the barricade. Soldiers were dragging bodies to use as building materials. They had retaken the breach. Barely. At a cost measured in corpses. Thurn tried to stand and could not. The world was spinning. Someone carried him to the rear, laid him in the command area. A surgeon came, an old man who had more experience with veterinary work than combat wounds. The surgeon cut away Thurn's shirt and examined the damage. Broken ribs, deep gash, significant blood loss. He wrapped the wounds tightly and gave Thurn wine mixed, with something that tasted like poison. "You need to rest," the surgeon said. "You will die if you do not." Thurn closed his eyes, just for a moment, just to catch his breath. In the Imperial camp, Charles Bonaventure de Longueval, Count of Bucquoy, sat in his command tent and confronted an uncomfortable truth. He was losing, not militarily. His forces still outnumbered the rebels 40-1. He had more weapons, more ammunition, more of everything. In a war of pure attrition, he would inevitably win. But wars were not fought in isolation. They were fought in the context of logistics, weather, politics, and time. His supply situation was deteriorating. The wagons bringing food and ammunition from Vienna were delayed by bad roads. Summer storms had turned the approaches into swamps. His army required thousands of pounds of food daily. The local countryside had been stripped clean. Soldiers were going hungry. The casualty reports were devastating. Over 4,000 dead or wounded in less than a week. These were not expendable conscripts. They were professional soldiers, trained men who represented years of investment and could not be easily replaced. He was hemorrhaging his most valuable asset, fighting for a minor strategic position. His officers were openly questioning the campaign. Why were they dying to take a mountain pass? Why not bypass it, march around, approach Prague from a different direction? The rebels had no cavalry, no ability to intercept a mobile force. The pass was meaningless if the Imperial army simply went somewhere else. Bucquoy had no good answer except pride. He had committed to this assault. Withdrawing now would look like defeat. The rebels would claim victory. Protestant regions across the empire would be emboldened. Ferdinand would question his competence, but staying was equally problematic. Every day the siege dragged on. Every casualty report sent to Vienna, every supply wagon that failed to arrive, weakened his position. There was another factor eating at him: intelligence reports from the north. Saxon troops were mobilizing, not moving yet, but assembling, preparing. If they marched south while his army was pinned at the pass, he could face a two-front war. His strategic position was becoming untenable. Late at night, after his officers had left, Bucquoy studied maps by candlelight. The pass was a fixed point. His army was a fixed point. Both were becoming vulnerabilities. Fixed targets could be isolated, surrounded, starved out. The fundamental principle of military strategy was flexibility. Maintain freedom of movement. Never commit so heavily to one position that retreat becomes impossible. He had violated that principle, and now he was paying for it. Outside his tent, soldiers sat around fires and talked in low voices. The morale that had been so high at the campaign's start was cracking. Men who had expected easy victory were instead dying in waves against peasant farmers. The humiliation was worse than the casualties. A Spanish tercio sergeant told his men they were fighting the wrong battle. This was not war. This was grinding yourself down against a stone that would not break. Sieges like this did not end in glory. They ended in mass graves and nothing gained. Bucquoy knew his soldiers were losing faith. He could feel the army's cohesion eroding. If he pushed much harder, if he ordered one more massive assault that failed, he risked mass desertions. Professional soldiers did not break easily, but they were not stupid. When the cost outweighed any conceivable benefit, they walked away. Ferdinand's orders had been clear. Crush the rebellion, make an example, restore imperial authority. But orders from distant palaces did not account for mud and casualties and supply problems. Orders did not account for an enemy that refused to behave like defeated peasants should behave. Bucquoy made a decision. One more assault. Everything committed. If it succeeded, the rebellion would be broken. If it failed, he would withdraw and find another approach. One more throw of the dice. Then he would reassess. He called for his officers and began planning the final assault. The assault began at dawn with a bombardment that dwarfed everything that had come before. Every cannon in the Imperial arsenal fired simultaneously. The mountain shook. the air filled with smoke so thick that visibility dropped to arm's reach. Under that covering fire, 20,000 Imperial soldiers advanced, not probing, not testing. This was total commitment. Bucquoy had ordered every available unit into the assault, infantry, dismounted cavalry, engineers carrying siege equipment, everything. The defenders watched them come through breaks in the smoke. An ocean of men in formation covering the entire valley floor, climbing the slopes from 3 directions simultaneously. Thurn stood on the ramparts despite his wounds. He should have been in the medical area, should have been resting. His officers had begged him to stay back. He refused. The men needed to see him, needed to know their commander had not abandoned them. His voice was hoarse from shouting orders. "Hold your positions, fire on my command, stand together." The words felt inadequate. What do you say to men about to be overwhelmed? What comfort exists when death is climbing toward you in formation? The Imperial forces reached musket range. The defenders fired. Hundreds of muskets, a ragged volley that dropped the front ranks. The Imperials kept coming. They fired their own volley. Musket balls hammered the earthworks. Defenders fell, dead before they understood what had hit them. Then, the assault hit the fortifications like a physical wave. Thousands of soldiers throwing themselves at the defenses simultaneously. The fighting became universal, apocalyptic. Every position engaged at once. A young defender, maybe 17, stood at his position firing and reloading with mechanical precision. He had become numb to the horror. His hands moved through the loading sequence automatically while his mind retreated somewhere far away. He did not see the Imperial soldier who climbed over the earthwork behind him, did not feel the pike that went through his back. Just stopped existing. A section of the northern palisade collapsed under concentrated axework. Imperial engineers had systematically hacked it apart. Soldiers poured through. The defense cracked, then shattered. Defenders ran. The position was lost. But the breakthrough could not be exploited. The narrow terrain that had protected the defenders also constrained the attackers. The Imperial soldiers could not spread out, could not bring their numbers to bear. They were channeled into killing zones where desperate defenders met them with everything that remained. Then the sky opened. Rain, torrential, sudden, the kind of summer storm that appears without warning. Within seconds, visibility dropped to nothing. The slopes turned to mud. Soldiers lost their footing, sliding backward down the hillside they had just climbed. The Imperial formations dissolved, men separated from their units in the chaos. Officers screamed orders that were lost in the roar of rain and thunder. The coordinated assault became a confused mess of individual soldiers struggling simply to stay upright. The defenders, fighting from fixed positions, had advantage in the sudden storm. They knew the terrain. They could hold their ground while the attackers slipped and fell. Bucquoy, watching from the valley, saw his assault falling apart, not from enemy action, but from weather. His soldiers were scattered across the slopes, cohesion gone, the momentum that should have carried them to victory dissipating in rain and mud. He made a decision in that moment, the decision that would define the campaign. He ordered retreat. Horns sounded through the storm. The signal to withdraw, pull back, regroup. The Imperial soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, needed no encouragement. They retreated down the slopes, leaving their dead behind. On the mountain, the defenders stood in the rain and could not believe what they were seeing. The assault was stopping. The Empire was withdrawing. They had held. Impossibly. Against every calculation, they had held. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started. The clouds broke, and afternoon sun streamed through, illuminating a landscape transformed into a nightmare. Bodies covered the slopes, thousands of them, Imperial and rebel both, so intermixed that it was impossible to distinguish sides. The rain had washed blood down the hillside in rivulets that stained the valley floor red. In the Imperial camp, Bucquoy made his final decision. He ordered a general withdrawal, not a retreat exactly, a strategic redeployment, the kind of language commanders used when they did not want to admit defeat. The army began packing. Tents came down, artillery pieces were loaded onto wagons, supply trains were organized for the march south. The process took 2 days. The entire time, the rebels watched from the mountain, unable to believe what they were seeing. The Empire was leaving. 100,000 men, the most powerful military force in Central Europe, was withdrawing from a pass held by fewer than 2,000 effective defenders. Bucquoy rode at the head of the column as the army marched away. He looked back once at the mountain, a minor fortress on unremarkable terrain. It should have fallen in an afternoon. Instead, it had cost him a week, 5,000 casualties, and his reputation. He would return to Vienna and make his report to Ferdinand. He would explain the logistics problems, the weather, the unexpected resistance. He would request reinforcements and propose alternative strategies for suppressing the rebellion. But he knew what the emperor would hear. Failure. The invincible imperial army, stopped by peasant farmers. The humiliation would echo across Europe. On the mountain, the defenders did not celebrate. They were too exhausted, too traumatized, too aware of what they had survived. They sat among the ruins of their fortifications and tried to process that they were still alive. Casualty reports came to Thurn: 900 dead, 1,100 wounded, many of whom would die in the coming days from infection or injuries too severe to treat. Of the original 2,700, barely 800 remained combat effective. They had lost a third of their force, but they had held. Thurn stood at the highest point of the pass, his wounds bandaged, his body a catalogue of pain. He watched the imperial army disappear over the southern horizon, a line of wagons and marching troops stretching for miles. He had done it. Not won exactly, but survived. Delayed the empire, bought time for Protestant forces to organize, proved that resistance was possible. News would spread. A garrison of volunteers had faced the empire and refused to break. Protestant regions across Central Europe would hear the story, would be inspired, would resist. He did not know that within days, troops would arrive from Saxony and the Palatinate, that his desperate stand would become the nucleus of a real army, that the Bohemian revolt would spread across the empire, igniting a war that would consume Europe for 30 years. He just knew they had held. For 72 hours, against impossible odds, they had held. A young soldier approached him, one of the few university students who had survived. He asked Thurn what happened next. Thurn looked at the empty valley. The empire would return. Ferdinand would send more armies. The rebellion was far from over. In truth, it was barely beginning. The real battles, the truly devastating conflicts, were still ahead. But for now, for this moment, they had won something more valuable than territory. They had won proof. Proof that empires could be defied, that small forces could resist overwhelming power, that courage and desperation and refusal to surrender could accomplish the impossible. They had held the pass, and Europe would never be the same. The aftermath of the pass came in waves. First, the practical horror of burying the dead, then the slow realization of what they had accomplished. Then the consequences that would echo for decades. The burial details worked for days. Mass graves were dug on both sides of the pass. Protestant clergy performed services over hundreds of bodies at once. Many of the dead could not be identified. They were buried as unknown soldiers, their names lost to history. The wounded filled every available structure. The makeshift hospital could not accommodate them all. Men lay in rows in the open air, bandaged with whatever cloth could be found. The surgeons worked until their hands shook from exhaustion. Many of the wounded died anyway. Infection, blood loss, injuries too severe for 16th century medicine. Among the dead was the farmer Jan, the one who had written letters to his daughters. His body was identified by the folded paper still tucked inside his shirt. Someone promised to deliver the letter. Whether it ever reached his family is unknown. The university student who had prayed with the chaplain before the battle survived. He would live another 50 years, marry, have children, and spend the rest of his life unable to explain to them what those 3 days on the mountain had been like. The mercenary Sergeant Klaus, who had held a breach with 3 missing fingers, died of his wounds 2 days after the battle. His last words, according to those present, were a request for wine and an observation that he had been paid for worse jobs. Thurn's wounds healed slowly. The gash across his ribs became infected. Fever nearly killed him. He spent weeks recovering, unable to command, barely able to speak. When he finally rose from his sickbed, the strategic situation had transformed. Protestant forces from across Central Europe had mobilized. The story of the pass had spread like fire, 2,000 volunteers holding against 100,000 Imperial troops. The numbers grew with each retelling until the story became legend. Saxon regiments arrived, units from the Palatinate marched into Bohemia, Protestant nobles who had been wavering, uncertain whether to support the rebellion, now committed. The pass had proved resistance was possible. That changed everything. By autumn, Thurn commanded a real army, 20,000 men, properly equipped, professionally trained. The ragtag militia that had held the pass became the veteran core of a force that would challenge the empire across Bohemia. But this was not a happy ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of the 30 Years' War, the most devastating conflict Europe had yet seen. Millions would die. Germany would be depopulated. Entire regions would be reduced to wasteland. The rebellion that started with 3 men thrown from a window and continued at a mountain pass would consume a continent. 1620, 2 years after the pass, the Bohemian army would face Imperial forces at the Battle of White Mountain, just outside Prague. This time, the Bohemians would be crushed, the rebellion would be destroyed, the Protestant nobility would be executed or exiled, Bohemia would be forcibly re-Catholicized, Thurn would survive, flee to exile, die decades later in a foreign country. The soldiers who held the pass with him would be scattered, killed, forgotten. The rebellion they fought for would fail. But for 72 hours in the summer of 1618, they had done the impossible. They had stood when standing seemed futile. They had fought when fighting seemed suicidal. They had held when holding should have been impossible. History would remember the great battles that came after, the sieges of cities, the clashes of massive armies, the peace treaties signed in distant palaces. But it all began at a small pass in Bohemia, where courage bought time, where desperation defied an empire, where ordinary people proved that impossible is just a word. The pass changed nothing in the long term. The empire would win, the rebellion would fail. But for one brief moment, the impossible happened. And sometimes that is enough.